This media content is brought to you by Right Dream Productions.
The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest. The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest. The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest.
Large aspects of the narrative contained within this episode have been derived from the testimonies of witnesses and the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry into the attempted coup in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on Friday, the 27th of July, 1990. The coalition party of the NAR rode into power on the back of an overwhelming mandate, winning 33 of then 36 constituencies at the 1986 general elections. Comprising of 4 parties: the Organization for National Reconstruction, led by eminent barrister and former AG Carl Hudson Phillips; the United Labour Front, led by barrister, trade unionist and future Prime Minister Basdeo Panday; the Democratic Action Congress, led by former THA leader, former PNM Minister, future Prime Minister and future President ANR Robinson; and the Tapia House Movement, led by esteemed economist Dr. Lloyd Best. The death of Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams on March 29, 1981 rocked the country, the region and the world. Despite the best efforts of George Chambers to tighten the nation's coffers, the PNM was unable to recover. More importantly, the country was outraged by the levels of horrific corruption under the PNM, the party that led it to independence and Republican status. It was said that former Minister of Energy John O'Halloran looted the nation's treasury, and while there were investigations into the man labeled as Mr. 10%, known for his reputation of taking 10% signing bonus on everything, his obfuscations were sophisticated. They ranged from his personal taxes on sales of aeroplanes, horse racing, construction, and the petroleum industry. He held nothing in his name, and in 1985 he died without a will. This intestacy was another means of trickery. While the NAR government was able to recover $7 million in a court action against McDonnell Douglas, Tesoro Petroleum, many of O'Halloran's sophisticated thefts were too historical, while others were impossible to trace. The people's outrage resulted in catastrophic losses at the general elections for the PNM. One of the promises of the NAR party in their campaigning and manifesto was the regularization of all squatters. Surely this promise would benefit the Jamat, whose social programs were noteworthy, but who were also having problems acquiring legal title to the Mucurapo lands. The question is whether central government had the legal authority to give away Port of Spain City Corporation lands, and if so, whether it would be willing to do so for the Jamat. According to the Commission, Prime Minister Robinson appointed Dr. Brinsley Samaru, who was the Minister of Local Government, with finding a formula for resolving the Jamat's occupation of the Mucurapo lands. This was occurring in a country in economic decline, grappling with unemployment, disdain for politicians, the removal of subsidies, and the imposition of a strict culture of austerity. Remember those 2 Black Power militants mentioned previously who were sentenced to death? Well, as part of the recommendations of the Mercy Committee on the 31st of August 1987, a presidential pardon was granted by Noor Hassan Ali to both Kirkland and Thomas, who interestingly converted to Islam and joined the Jamat. The Jamat's popularity grew immensely, and Dr. Selwyn Ryan, in Youth at Risk, No Time to Quit, stated that in 1989, the year before the attempted coup, membership of the Jamat climbed to 12,000. The Jamaat's Mucurapo compound continued to be subjected to police raids. The TTPS claimed to have received information relating to firearms possession and allegations of harboring criminals. The Jamaat, despite its extensive social and literacy programs, could not escape the allegations of providing a safe haven to persons with criminal matters before the court. The Sir David Simmons Commission of Inquiry concluded that special branch reports revealed that in August 1989, the Jamaat were discussing the assassination of Prime Minister Robinson, and that Abu Bakr, Bilal Abdullah, and Salim Muwakil were actively plotting this assassination. Reports stated that the Jamaat were negotiating support from Gaddafi in Libya for money, weapons, and ammunition. As mentioned, the Jamaat did have ties to Libya, having sent many of its membership for education programs, but also for weapons and explosives training. A Libyan national, El Gahwagi, visited Trinidad and was introduced to a 400-member congregation of the Jamaat. Informants confirmed that based on a 1989 meeting that senior member Bilal Abdullah had with members of the Jamaat, he possessed a deep interest in how large caches of arms and ammunition could be imported. A customs officer and member of the Jamaat would use his position to facilitate the entry of weapons into the Republic. A reconnaissance team in December of 1989 used a visit to TTT's television house to sell gifts in order to learn the layout of the building. Former Assistant Police Commissioner and former Head of Special Branch Mervyn Giuseppe testified before the Commission that Special Branch had sources within the Jamaat and knew that an uprising was imminent, although the form of which to them was not conclusive. Of the Jamaat's membership, there were 8 former TTDF members and 5 former TTPS officers. They were involved in training Jamaat members in the jungles of Rio Claro, Kumuto, Toko, Blanchisez, and Kumaka, while 25 other members were sent to Libya. Others were sent to Sudan. The source of funds to mount an operation of the size of July 27th came from several streams. Abu Bakr, personally, he also obtained funds from Libya, donations from local businessmen, donations from membership, and funds seized from drug blocks. Special Branch presented a series of intelligence reports that the Jamaat wanted to exploit the dire economic situation to fulfill their long-awaited dream of making the Republic an Islamic state. That appointments of President Hassan Ali and Speaker Nizam Mohammed were signs from Allah. Further, that after Juma on 29th of July 1988, about 50 members of the Jamaat discussed the security arrangements for Prime Minister Robinson. And on the 27th of April, Abu Bakr, Loris Balak and Omawal discussed mounting attacks against Anthony Sabga, Senator Selby Wilson, Senator Ken Gordon, and Justice Wills. What was not known to many was that well before the events of July 27th, Abu Bakr made a personal appearance at Camp Ogden. Bakr and the Jamaat were under pressure and were becoming desperate, and so they chose to speak to someone in a position of authority. The commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, who had authority over the soldiers on the neighboring land, was Colonel Vidal. Upon learning of Bakr's presence, the Lieutenant Colonel, called Chief of Defense Staff Colonel Joseph Theodore, he told Vidal to wait. The Commission of Inquiry noted that based on Colonel Vidal's testimony, Minister of National Security Selwyn Richardson permitted the meeting. Abu Bakr pleaded that the armed soldiers' presence on the neighboring lands was causing the people of the Jamaat distress. Vidal also testified that Bakr tried to appeal to anyone who would listen, and this included the Chief Justice and the Commissioner of Police. On the 24th of July, 1990, the Jamaat made an application for judicial review of the decision of the Minister of National Security to install the TTDF and the TTPS on lands near to Mucurapo. This application was, however, dismissed by Justice Ivor Blackman. This created what is known in international relations as a security dilemma, where the increase in security results in fear by another, in this case the Jamaat, that an attack on them was inevitable. In the leadership's eyes, a preemptive strike at the heart of the problem was deemed as the only solution. The contingent of 114 men left the Mucurapo compound on the 27th of July, right under the observation of the TTDF, whose camp was posted on neighboring lands. Armed with rifles, pistols, and grenades later determined to be smuggled in from the United States, they headed for Port of Spain. The Commission of Inquiry concluded that the 27th was chosen because Abu Bakr and Bilal Abdullah felt that the great public interest of the 1990 Shell Cup football finals carded for that evening at the National Stadium meant that public safety and security for the event would have been the center of attention for the TTPS. The Commission provided further evidence that the insurrection was in planning well before the fateful day. The Mucurapo compound was abuzz with activity during the day on Friday the 27th of July, as unusually large groups of persons arrived in taxis and other modes of transport. The Jamaat's membership was preparing for a visit from a prince. This prince, however, was not real. He was merely a counter-surveillance tool employed by Bakr and Jamaat's second-in-command, Bilal Abdullah, to throw off the military and the police. And it worked. Abu Bakr led the operation at Television House, but not before an advance party which consisted of Hassan Anyabwil was deployed. At Television House, among others, would be trusted senior lieutenants who held executive authority: Lance Small, Carla Akibua, and Loris Balak. Bilal Abdullah led the Red House assault. The Red House team would include an armed boy who was to celebrate his 14th birthday on the 28th of July. Bilal is alleged to have had a special interest in weapons and alleged to have acquired weapons training in Miami. To what extent at the time of the insurrection remains unknown to the public. He was also alleged to have had experience in negotiations. Jamal Shabazz led his own team of approximately 30 insurgents. They stormed Radio Trinidad. This included a group that firebombed the National Broadcasting Service. This fire, however, was quickly extinguished. Meanwhile, a repeated message of "the government has fallen. Most of the protected services have defected to the Jamaat, and those who have not done so are advised to do so. There is to be no looting," was read by Edison Carr. This was read under the instructions of Jamal Shabazz, and none other than Andy Thomas. Yes, the same Andy Thomas who was sentenced to death but received a presidential pardon for the murder of a policeman during the Black Power period. The Jamaat also had roving teams of shooters who roamed around the city in cars. Their purpose was to engage the first responders of the protective services in firefights. They also strategically fired on police stations with a view of confining officers. Number 25 St. Vincent Street housed the Solicitor General's office. It was directly opposite the Red House, and its location also gave it an uninterrupted view of the police headquarters on Sackville Street. At about 5:57 p.m., alone in her chamber, was Assistant Solicitor General Miss Lynette Stevenson. Stevenson, providing testimony before the Commission, stated that she looked out the window and saw a young man of African descent walking down Sackville Street with a brown paper bag in his hand. He approached Officer McLeod and spoke to him. Officer McLeod, according to Stevenson, stepped from the archway to the police headquarters and onto the pavement. He turned west and pointed to the Sacred Heart Church when the young man drew from the brown paper bag a gun, raised it, and fired shots into Officer Solomon McLeod's chest. Officer McLeod fell, clutching his chest. The young man then fired at least 8 more shots as Officer McLeod lay motionless. The shooter fired a shot into the air and fled. Meanwhile, a VBIED was driven by a Jamaat tactical team bound for the police headquarters where it was to be detonated, and the Jamaat team drove over his body. The team gained entry and detonated the IED. The TTPS lost its command center, and there was major concern for prisoners being held in cells as fire and smoke started to spread across Port of Spain's skies. A temporary command center was subsequently erected at the traffic branch on South Quay, but not before confusion and fear engulfed the country's police service. Officers were reported as being too nervous to patrol the streets, opting rather to stay indoors. There was no attempt to muster off-duty officers. Police officers in stations across some parts of the country were under fire as the Jamaat's roving teams fired upon them. There was no plan to respond to the firing, which only ended the following morning. Acting Deputy Commissioner Leslie Marcel attempted to organize some officers at the headquarters after the device was detonated. He managed to make it to the roof on a part of the headquarters to engage Jamaat shooters who were situated on a crane at a nearby construction site. However, the roof caved in. He fell and was severely injured.
Breaking news: insurrection in Trinidad and Tobago. We can confirm that a coup d'etat on the Caribbean twin island is underway. Reports suggest that the parliament is under siege by members of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, led by Imam Yassin Abu Bakr and his men. We now hand you over to our Latin America and Caribbean correspondent, Laura Glasgow. Laura, are you there?
Hi, Raymond. I am not sure whether you can hear me, but I can hear you. What we can say is that the Jamaat has had a land dispute with the state that spans almost 30 years. We do know that the leadership under Abu Bakr tried the courts on a number of occasions to resolve this matter, but the outcome had not been favorable. The Jamaat had been subject to raids on a frequent basis, and this may have been another factor. In the past, members of the Jamaat have been detained, some even killed while in police custody, but the land dispute remains key to this. A car with explosives made its way into the police headquarters in Port of Spain, where it was detonated. We can also confirm that Bakr himself is at the broadcast house of Trinidad's television center. As only moments ago, he gave an insight into the status of the Twin Islands' future.
Where is the Prime Minister tonight to address the nation? Where is he?
That the revolutionary forces were instructed to command the streets. He went on to state that the military was already on his side and that looting would not be tolerated. Nonetheless, looting was widespread, and it was devastating, continuing for over 20 hours. The TTPS did not respond until 3 p.m. on Saturday, 28th of July, as chaos engulfed the east-west corridor. Communications equipment were jammed, and police were outnumbered by Jamaat members and hostile looters. The commission concluded that, on the evidence provided, arson and looting caused losses estimated at approximately $450 million. There were rumors that the TTDF was also involved in looting by eyewitnesses in St. James. These were, however, dispelled as Colonel Ralph Brown submitted that an assessment was made that the siege could be prolonged and possibly deplete the military's rations, Informed by this, the TTDF networked with Minister of Education Clive Pantin and the owners of the supermarket chain True Value to have the army obtain supplies on their inventory list from the Long Circular Mall True Value outlet. According to Colonel Brown, a receipt was requested and later paid for by the Ministry of Finance. According to the Commission of Inquiry, the topic before the House of Representatives was the corruption under the previous PNM government. The House suspended sitting at 4:30 p.m. with resumption scheduled for 5:15 p.m. At 5:15, Nizam Mohammed Speaker was absent, and Deputy Speaker Dr. Anselm St. George took to the Speaker's chair to officiate the proceedings. Also absent was Basdeo Panday and MP Maurice Marshall. Patrick Manning, according to the Commission, returned to the chamber but left quickly after. At 5:45 p.m., when Joseph Tony was addressing the chamber, he asked Trevor Sudama, "Who is your leader?" upon which gunshots, shouting and shattering glass was soon heard. It was Bilal Abdul and his team. Chaos reigned. Some present managed to escape. Among the escapees was Member of Parliament Kelvin Ramnat. Muriel Donawa McDavidson, PNM member, was allowed to leave. Her driver, however, was shot and killed. Prime Minister Robinson's driver fired a volley of shots on the Abercrombie Street side of the Red House, but was met with fire from the Jamaat. He was wounded and would eventually lose his leg. Special branch members, part of Robinson's security detail, incapable of engaging the insurgents in a firefight, initially protected him by forming a shield around him. Sergeant Steve Maurice, Corporal Charles and PC Pilgrim were all violently assaulted by the insurgents. A Sergeant Julian escaped onto the roof of the Parliament, where he was shot at, but remained hidden until Sunday. Julian was eventually caught, severely beaten and tortured. Wendell Eversley, a 19-year-old at the time who was there to observe the parliamentary proceedings, was also held captive, despite other people in the public gallery being allowed to leave. He observed the terror and crawled around as bullets entered and exited the Red House. Eversley was horrified as a wounded and bleeding woman was placed next to him. Lorraine Caballero was her name, and sadly, she eventually succumbed to her wounds to become one of the July 27th fatalities. Member of Parliament for Diego Martin Central Leo Devines tried to flee the parliamentary chamber but was shot in his leg. Member of Parliament Raul Raphael testified before the Commission that a wounded Devines came back and told him, "Tell my wife and children that I loved them." Though taken from Parliament on Saturday the 28th of July, MP Devines succumbed to his injury and died on the 1st of August 1990. Upon storming the House of Representatives chamber under the leadership of former St. Mary's College and University of the West Indies graduate Bilal Abdullah, the Jamaat insurgents were searching for a number of persons. In total, there were 6 cabinet members and 10 other members of Parliament. Of course, many of the parliamentarians hid under desks. It turns out that some of the persons whom the Jamaat requested were not to be harmed. These were Senator George Weeks, who was absent, Nizam Mohammed, Speaker of the House, who was absent, and Basdeo Panday, who was also absent. The Jamaat insisted that they were to be given safe passage out of the Parliament. They also expressed that no women would be hurt. Then there were the others. Selby Wilson, Minister of Finance, whom they referred to as the IMF man, and Selwyn Richardson, National Security Minister, who was considered responsible for installing the military and the TTPS on lands neighbouring Mucurapo. Mr. Palaktari Singh, who escaped and hid in a committee room, was subsequently found by an insurgent and returned to the chamber where he was bound and placed on the floor. So too were Trevor Sudama, who suffered a slight gunshot injury, John Humphrey, and Dr. Emmanuel Hossain. Prime Minister Robinson and Selwyn Richardson were severely beaten. Robinson, according to Joseph Tony, received many blows to his face, but did not utter any sound, whereas Selwyn Richardson could be heard pleading while being subject to brutality. Testimony to the commission by Selby Wilson stated that Bilal, who was armed with a pistol, said to Robinson, while thrusting a walkie-talkie into his hands, "Will you instruct the regiment to withdraw and lay down their guns, because the government has fallen?" In what became a costly act of defiance in the face of grave danger, Prime Minister Robinson spoke the words into the walkie-talkie, "These people are murderers, torturers, attack with full force." The eyewitness stated that Bilal took the radio from him and said, "So you have no regard for the lives of your ministers?" Then, without a subsequent word, he fired one shot, each at Mr. Robinson and Mr. Richardson. Both men screamed and groaned. Mr. Robinson shouted at the men that though he was shot, he was prepared to die for his country. During his testimony at the Commission of Inquiry, however, when asked who shot the Prime Minister, Mr. Bilal stated that he did not know. Later on in the night, an insurgent tried to gag Mr. Robinson by placing a piece of cloth into his mouth with the muzzle of a gun and shoved it down his throat. Mr. Robinson testified that he vomited. It was at this point that Dr. Hossain intervened to let the insurgents know that it would result in the Prime Minister's death. Shortly after 8 p.m., the security detail was allowed to leave, stripped down to their underwear. Tension was mounting as the TTDF maintained gunfire on the Red House. At about 9:20, Bilal approached Mr. Dukaran, placed a pistol to his neck, and ordered him to tell headquarters that negotiations would be had and that the TTDF should stop firing. Mr. Dukaran did so, and moments after he crawled some feet to the steps of the VIP gallery in the chamber, where he laid on a step. Bilal Abdullah approached him and warned him that if there was any breakdown in negotiations, that MPs would be shot and thrown over the banister. At around 10 p.m., moments after Bilal's warning to Dukaran, Joseph Tony, Dukaran, John Humphrey, Trevor Sudama, and Bilal Abdullah became engaged in negotiations of surrender discussions. One of the more prominent conditions of negotiations was the resignation of Mr. Robinson as Prime Minister. This was all to be mediated by Canon Nolly Clark, upon which Mr. Dukaran would assume the role of interim Prime Minister with an amnesty, the terms of surrender, and a general election to be held in 90 days. At about 1:30 a.m., Bilal was informed that Canon Clark was contacted and would be joining talks. Despite negotiations being had, where Joseph Tony eventually read aloud the contents and obtained parliamentarians' signatures, tension remained heightened. Bilal informed that he was in possession of intelligence that the TTDF was planning to mount an assault to free the hostages. A sixth point was then added to the agreement that Mr. Dukaran and Canon Clark would return to the Red House with the signed amnesty agreement. According to the Commission, Canon Clark bravely made his way to the Red House between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m. on Saturday the 28th of July. After being briefed by Bilal that he should take the amnesty to the President, Mr. Dukaran and Canon Clark were released and made their way to Camp Ogden. Interestingly, the Jamaat leadership did not negotiate for the land. They wanted Robinson gone, since they determined that his policies were oppressive to both the Jamaat and to the people of the Republic. On Saturday, 28th of July, a state of emergency was declared by Acting President Carter. Along with the SOE was the imposition of a 22-hour curfew around TTT's proximate designated area. The Red House, on the other hand, understandably, had a 24-hour curfew. By Sunday, the 29th, Minister Herbert Atwell updated the changes of the dusk-to-dawn curfew, which was mentioned by Dr. Carson Charles in a preceding broadcast. The curfew was being extended from 12 to 18 hours, and during these times, no one would be allowed on the streets unless they were in possession of a curfew pass. The streets were to be monitored by the joint patrol arrangement between the TTDF and the TTPS.